On the afternoon of January 29, 1945, in a frozen Belgian village whose name most Americans could not pronounce, a man who stood 5 feet 5 inches tall and weighed 138 pounds made a decision that would kill 21 human beings in less time than it takes to tie a boot. He was outnumbered. He was exhausted. He had been fighting without meaningful rest for 7 months. The German officer standing 3 feet from his chest held a weapon aimed directly at his sternum and was smiling because he believed the war, at least for this particular American, was over. First Sergeant Leonard Funk of the 82nd Airborne Division looked into that smile and chose violence so sudden and so complete that it would be studied in staff colleges for the next 80 years. This is not a story about heroism. This is a story about mathematics, exhaustion, and the kind of decision that cannot be unmade. Leonard Funk did not look like a soldier. In an army of tall, corn-fed farm boys and broad-shouldered factory workers, he appeared almost comically out of place. Born in Braddock, Pennsylvania in 1916, he grew up in the kind of steel town where the sky was the color of rust, and every man's father worked the mills until his lungs turned black. Funk was too small for the mills, too small, by most measures, for anything that required physical dominance. But there is a difference between size and presence, between mass and will, and Leonard Funk understood this distinction in ways that larger men never would. When he enlisted in the Army in 1942, the recruitment officer looked at him with visible skepticism. Paratroopers were supposed to be elite. They were supposed to be physically intimidating. Funk was neither, but he could run forever. He could carry weight that would break men 6 inches taller. And he possessed something that no physical examination could measure, an ability to make decisions under conditions that reduced other men to paralysis. By June of 1944, Funk was a squad leader in Company C, 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne Division. He had survived the jump into Normandy, survived the bocage, survived the kind of small unit fighting where you learned the names of enemy dead, because you had been killing them for weeks in the same 200 yards of muddy French farmland. Normandy was not the war that people imagined. It was not grand strategy or sweeping armored columns. It was hedgerows and snipers, and the constant, grinding mathematics of attrition. Every day you woke up and calculated, how many men did I have yesterday? How many do I have now? How many will I have tomorrow if we keep losing 2 per day to wounds and 3 per week to death, and 1 per month to the kind of psychological fracture that turns a functional soldier into a liability? Funk was good at this math. He was good at keeping men alive not through inspiration or charisma, but through a cold-eyed understanding of what worked and what did not. He did not tell his men they were heroes. He told them to keep their heads down, to move in pairs, to never trust a building until someone else had cleared it first. This was not the leadership taught in manuals. It was the leadership that emerged when manuals became irrelevant. After Normandy came the liberation of France, and after France came Belgium, and after Belgium came the disaster of Operation Market Garden. September of 1944, the operation that was supposed to end the war by Christmas. The 82nd Airborne dropped into Holland as part of the largest airborne operation in history, and for 72 hours it looked like it might actually work. And then it did not work. The Germans counterattacked with a ferocity that nobody had anticipated. The weather turned. Resupply failed. The British armored column that was supposed to relieve them got stuck in traffic that stretched for 15 miles. And the paratroopers, who had been promised a quick operation followed by rest, found themselves fighting house to house in Dutch towns with names like Nijmegen and Groesbeek, holding a corridor that the Germans wanted to cut more than they wanted to breathe. Funk earned his first Silver Star in Holland, not for a single dramatic act, but for 72 consecutive hours of the kind of leadership that prevents a platoon from disintegrating when everything else is disintegrating around it. His lieutenant had been killed on the second day. His platoon sergeant had been evacuated with shrapnel wounds that turned his left leg into a medical curiosity. And Funk, who was not supposed to be in command of anything larger than a squad, found himself responsible for 42 men in a situation where 42 men could die in 42 different ways if someone did not make correct decisions very quickly and very consistently. He made those decisions. He kept those men alive. And when the British tanks finally arrived and the operation was declared a qualified success despite being a comprehensive failure, Funk had been promoted to platoon sergeant and had not slept more than 3 hours in any single night for 2 weeks. By December of 1944, the 82nd Airborne had been pulled back to France for rest and refitting. They had been fighting since June. They had jumped into Normandy, fought through France, jumped into Holland and fought through Holland. They were exhausted in ways that went beyond physical tiredness. They were exhausted in the way that happens when you have seen too many friends die, when you have killed too many enemies, when you have existed in a state of mortal fear for so long that fear stops being an emotion and becomes a kind of baseline condition of existence. The division was supposed to rest. They were supposed to train replacements, repair equipment, sleep in actual beds. And then, on December 16th, the Germans launched the largest offensive on the Western Front since 1940, and the 82nd Airborne was thrown into the Ardennes as an emergency reserve to prevent the entire American line from collapsing. The Battle of the Bulge was not like other battles. It was not a contest between two armies meeting on open ground with clear lines and defined objectives. It was chaos. It was frozen fog and burning vehicles and American units dissolving into fragments that did not know where they were or where the enemy was, or whether the man in the white camouflage 30 yards away was German or American or Belgian, or just another ghost in a forest full of ghosts. The temperature dropped to 10 degrees below zero. Snow fell in waves that turned roads into impassable tracks and turned forests into mazes where visibility was measured in yards. Men froze to death in their foxholes. Weapons froze. Vehicles froze. And still the fighting continued, not as grand maneuvers, but as thousands of small, vicious engagements between squads and platoons who were just trying to survive until morning. Funk was promoted to first sergeant in the first week of the battle. It was not a reward. It was a necessity. His company commander had been wounded. His executive officer had been killed. And someone needed to hold Company C together while it fought in conditions that made Normandy look like a training exercise. Funk did not want the promotion. Nobody wanted promotions in the Ardennes because promotions meant responsibility, and responsibility meant making decisions that would get people killed no matter what you decided. But Funk took the job because someone had to, and he was better at it than anyone else available. The 82nd Airborne was tasked with holding the northern shoulder of the Bulge, preventing the Germans from expanding their breakthrough and buying time for Patton's Third Army to counterattack from the south. This meant defending a series of small Belgian villages with names that nobody could pronounce, and that held no strategic value except that if the Germans took them, they could push deeper into Belgium and possibly reach the Meuse River and turn a temporary breakthrough into a catastrophic collapse. One of these villages was Holland. Population maybe 200 before the war, population 0 by January of 1945, because anyone with sense had fled west when the Germans came. It was a collection of stone houses and frozen roads, and a church with a steeple that provided excellent observation if you were willing to climb it and risk getting shot by a sniper, who was also using the steeple for observation from a different angle. Company C moved into Holland on January 26th. They were under strength. They had started the Bulge with 140 men and were now down to 96. Some had been killed. Some had been wounded. Some had been evacuated with frostbite so severe that their feet had turned black and would need to be amputated. The men who remained were fighting on willpower and hatred, and the knowledge that if they stopped fighting they would die, so they might as well keep fighting. They dug in. They established defensive positions. They sent out patrols, and they waited for the Germans to come. The Germans came on January 28th. not in the overwhelming numbers that had characterized the early days of the offensive, but in squad-sized probes designed to test American defenses and identify weak points for future attacks. Company C repelled them, killed some, captured others. By the evening of January 28th, they had 80 German prisoners sitting in the basement of the largest house in Holland, guarded by 4 soldiers who would have preferred to be doing literally anything else. Guarding prisoners was boring. It was cold. And it meant you were not with your squad, not with the men you trusted, but instead sitting in a basement with 80 Germans who looked at you with expressions that ranged from relief at being out of the fighting to barely concealed contempt at having been captured by Americans. Leonard Funk spent the evening of January 28th making his rounds. This was what first sergeants did. They checked positions. They made sure sentries were awake. They listened to complaints about frozen rations and broken equipment and the general injustice of being required to fight a war in Belgium in January when any reasonable person would be home in Pennsylvania or Texas or wherever home was. Funk listened. He did not have solutions. Nobody had solutions. But listening mattered because it meant someone cared. And in a war where most people did not care whether you lived or died, having someone care made a difference. On the morning of January 29th, Funk took 3 men and went on patrol. This was not standard procedure for a first sergeant. First sergeants were supposed to stay at company headquarters and manage logistics and administration. But Funk did not trust anyone else to do reconnaissance correctly, and in the Ardennes, bad reconnaissance got people killed faster than enemy artillery. They moved east, toward German lines, looking for signs of enemy movement or preparation for attack. They found nothing. The forest was silent except for the wind and the occasional crack of a tree branch breaking under the weight of ice. They returned to Holland around noon, cold and tired and ready for whatever passed for lunch in a war zone. When Funk and his 3 men entered the village, something was wrong. It was too quiet. Not the quiet of a defensive position waiting for attack, but the quiet of a defensive position that had already been attacked and lost. Funk raised his hand. The 3 men behind him stopped. They listened. And then they heard it, German voices. Not the subdued murmuring of prisoners, but the confident, loud conversation of soldiers who believed they were in control. What had happened was this. The 80 German prisoners, held in the basement with 4 guards, had been quietly working on a plan since their capture. They had noticed that their guards were exhausted, that they were rotated irregularly, that there were moments when only 1 or 2 guards were paying full attention. And they had noticed something else. The Americans had stacked captured German weapons in the corner of the basement rather than removing them entirely. This was a mistake born of exhaustion and overconfidence. The Germans were prisoners. They had surrendered. They were no longer a threat, except they were still soldiers, and soldiers do not stop being soldiers just because they have been captured. Sometime around 11 in the morning, while Funk was on patrol, the prisoners made their move. It was coordinated. It was fast. 1 prisoner feigned illness. When a guard approached, 2 other prisoners grabbed him. They took his rifle. They shot the other guards before those guards could react. And then 80 German soldiers, no longer prisoners, rearmed themselves with the weapons that had been conveniently stacked in the corner and began moving through the village, clearing buildings, killing or capturing any Americans they found. By the time Funk returned, the situation was this. Company C had been shattered. Most of the men were either dead, captured, or scattered into the forest. The Germans controlled the village, and they were now moving systematically through the remaining buildings, consolidating their position and preparing to hold Holland against any American counterattack. Funk and his 3 men moved carefully through the village, using the stone houses for cover, trying to understand what had happened and what to do about it. They reached a building on the southern edge of town and took cover inside. Through the window, Funk could see German soldiers moving in groups of 4 and 5, confident and organized. He counted at least 30, maybe more, and he had 3 men. The decision tree was simple and terrible. Option 1, retreat into the forest, regroup with whatever remained of Company C, and accept that Holland was lost. This was the tactically sound decision. It was the decision that would keep Funk and his 3 men alive. Option 2. Do something insane. The problem with Option 1 was that if Holland was lost, the Germans would use it as a base for further operations. They would bring up reinforcements. They would establish supply lines. And the northern shoulder of the Bulge, which had held for 6 weeks through conditions that defied description, might collapse. The problem with Option 2 was that it would almost certainly get Funk and his 3 men killed. Funk chose Option 2. He told his men to stay in the building and provide covering fire if needed. He told them that if he did not come back in 10 minutes, they should retreat and report to battalion. And then he walked out into the street with his Thompson submachine gun hanging from its sling and his hands raised in the universal gesture of surrender. The Thompson submachine gun is a remarkable weapon. Designed in 1918, perfected in 1921, it fires a .45 caliber round at a rate of 600 rounds per minute from a 30-round box magazine or a 50-round drum magazine. It weighs 10 pounds unloaded, 12 pounds loaded. It is exceptionally reliable, even in cold weather, even when covered in mud or ice. It is also exceptionally loud. The sound of a Thompson firing is not a crack or a pop, but a heavy, hammering roar that is unmistakable even at a distance. And in close quarters, in a narrow street or inside a building, the sound is overwhelming. It is disorienting. It creates a psychological effect that goes beyond the physical effect of the bullets themselves. Funk had carried his Thompson since Normandy. He knew its weight, its recoil, its rate of fire. He knew that a 30-round magazine lasted exactly 3 seconds if you held the trigger down, which meant you did not hold the trigger down unless you wanted to die with an empty weapon. He knew that the effective range was 50 yards, and beyond that you were wasting ammunition. He knew that in close combat, the Thompson was the single best weapon the American military had ever produced, better than the M1 Garand, better than the M1 carbine, better than any German weapon except possibly the Sturmgewehr, and nobody had seen one of those since Holland. As Funk walked into the street with his hands raised, German soldiers began to emerge from buildings and take positions around him. He counted them, 12, 15, 20. They were not panicked, they were not disorganized. They were professional soldiers who had just executed a successful operation and were now securing their prize. One of them, an officer, stepped forward. He was tall, he was confident, he was smiling. He raised his weapon and pointed it at Funk's chest from a distance of approximately 3 feet. The officer spoke in German. Funk did not speak German, but he understood the meaning. The war was over, drop your weapon, you are a prisoner now. Funk nodded. He began to lower his hands toward the sling of his Thompson, moving slowly, moving carefully, projecting defeat and exhaustion. The German officer watched him. The other German soldiers watched him. Nobody was particularly worried. This was a small American sergeant who had made a stupid decision to surrender rather than die in the forest, and now he would spend the rest of the war in a prisoner camp, and that was that. Funk's hands reached the Thompson. In a single motion, so fast that it did not register as motion until it was already complete, he brought the weapon up, flicked off the safety, and fired directly into the German officer's chest from a distance of 3 feet. The Thompson roared. The German officer went down, and for the next 45 seconds, Leonard Funk did not stop moving and did not stop firing. He swept the weapon left. 3 German soldiers were standing in a cluster near the corner of a building. He fired a burst. They went down. He pivoted right. 2 Germans were raising their weapons. He fired. They went down. He moved forward toward the center of the street, firing in short, controlled bursts, 3 to 5 rounds per target, exactly as he had been trained, exactly as he had practiced 10,000 times since Normandy. The sound was overwhelming. The muzzle flash was blinding in the gray winter light. And the Germans, who had been confident 30 seconds ago, were now experiencing something that humans are not psychologically equipped to handle. Sudden, close-range violence delivered by someone who had decided that his own survival was less important than killing everyone in front of him. The human brain requires time to process a reversal. When a man is surrendering, the brain categorizes him as non-threatening. When that same man suddenly becomes the most dangerous person in a 50-yard radius, the brain needs several seconds to recategorize, to understand that the threat model has changed, to issue the commands that will result in defensive action. Leonard Funk did not give them those seconds. He fired and moved, working his way through the German positions with a speed and precision that was not courage and was not heroism, but was instead the product of 7 months of continuous combat, and the understanding that if you are going to do something this insane, you must commit to it completely, or you will die. A German soldier appeared in a doorway to Funk's left. Funk fired without looking directly at him, trusting muscle memory and peripheral vision. The soldier went down. Another German, this one on the second floor of a building, fired a burst that missed Funk by inches and struck the wall behind him. Funk fired back. The Thompson's .45 caliber rounds punched through the wooden window frame, and the German fell backwards out of sight. Funk's magazine was empty. He dropped it, pulled a fresh magazine from his belt, slammed it home, and continued moving. The 3 American soldiers Funk had left in the building were now firing as well, adding their rifle fire to the chaos. The Germans, caught between Funk's Thompson and the rifles behind them, began to break. Some tried to run, some tried to fight, some simply froze, paralyzed by the sudden reversal of fortune and the sheer audacity of what was happening. Funk killed them methodically. This was not rage. This was not bloodlust. This was a man doing a job that needed to be done, and doing it with the same cold efficiency he brought to everything else. When it was over, 21 German soldiers were dead. 24 were wounded. The rest had surrendered again, this time with their hands raised much higher and their faces reflecting the understanding that they had made a catastrophic mistake. Funk's 3 men emerged from the building and began securing the prisoners. Funk reloaded his Thompson, checked his ammunition, and sat down on the steps of a house to wait for his hands to stop shaking. He had fired approximately 120 rounds. He had killed or wounded 45 men. He had done this in approximately 45 seconds, and he had done it with 0 American casualties. The mathematics were simple. 1 American first sergeant versus 80 German prisoners who had become 80 German soldiers who were now 59 German casualties and 21 German prisoners again. The mathematics were insane, but they were also indisputable. Word spread quickly. By the evening of January 29th, every unit in the 82nd Airborne had heard some version of the story. By the next day, it had reached division headquarters. By the end of the week, it was being discussed at corps level. And by the time the war in Europe ended in May of 1945, Leonard Funk's 45 seconds in Holland had become the kind of story that circulated in bars and officer clubs and training schools, growing with each retelling, but never quite managing to exaggerate beyond what had actually happened, because what had actually happened was already beyond exaggeration. The Medal of Honor recommendation was submitted in February. It was approved in March. The medal itself was presented by President Harry Truman in a ceremony at the White House in September of 1945. Truman, who had been an artillery captain in World War I and understood combat in ways that most presidents did not, looked at Funk and said something that was not recorded in the official transcript but was remembered by several witnesses. He said, "Son, I have read what you did. I do not understand how you are still alive." Funk did not have a good answer. He had asked himself the same question many times in the months between Holland and the White House, and he still did not have an answer that made sense. Luck was part of it. Skill was part of it. But mostly it was the fact that he had made a decision and committed to that decision with every ounce of focus and violence he possessed. And in that particular moment, in that particular place, it had worked. The German officer had hesitated for 1 second. The other Germans had hesitated for 2 or 3 seconds, and those seconds had been enough. After the war, Leonard Funk did not become a professional soldier. He did not write a memoir. He did not give lectures at West Point or appear in documentaries. He returned to Pennsylvania, worked for the Veterans Administration for 33 years, and lived a quiet life defined more by service to other veterans than by his own wartime experience. He married. He raised children. He helped other men navigate the bureaucracy of disability claims and pension applications, and the thousand small indignities that veterans faced when trying to access the benefits they had earned. And when people asked him about Holland, which they did occasionally, he gave short answers that did not include much detail and did not dwell on the killing. This was not modesty. This was not false humility. This was the reaction of a man who understood that 45 seconds of violence, no matter how tactically significant, no matter how widely celebrated, were still just 45 seconds. And 45 seconds could not define a life, should not define a life, especially when that life still had decades left to live. The irony, of course, was that history did define him by those 45 seconds. The Medal of Honor citation defined him by those 45 seconds. Military historians defined him by those 45 seconds. And when Leonard Funk died in March of 1993 at the age of 76, the obituaries all led with Holland, not with his 3 decades at the Veterans Administration. Not with his family or his community service or his quiet competence in helping other men navigate the aftermath of war. But with the day he killed 21 Germans and wounded 24 others in less than a minute. Perhaps this is inevitable. History remembers violence more clearly than it remembers administration. It remembers decisions made under fire more clearly than decisions made behind a desk. And it remembers the men who did impossible things in impossible circumstances more clearly than the men who did ordinary things with extraordinary consistency for decades. But there is another way to understand Leonard Funk's life, and it requires looking at the full arc rather than the single point. The man who walked into that Belgian street in January of 1945 was not a hero. He was a survivor. He was a man who had calculated the odds, found them unacceptable, and changed them through sheer willpower and tactical competence. And the man who spent 33 years helping veterans navigate bureaucracy was the same man, making the same calculation, finding the odds unacceptable, and changing them through the same combination of willpower and competence. The contexts were different. The stakes were different, but the fundamental character was identical. This is what the Medal of Honor recognized, even if the citation could only describe the violence. It was not recognizing courage in the abstract. It was recognizing the specific quality that allowed Leonard Funk to make a decision that every rational analysis said would fail, and to execute that decision with such precision that it succeeded anyway. That quality does not have a name. It is not taught in schools. It cannot be measured or quantified, but it exists. And in rare individuals, under rare circumstances, it manifests in ways that change outcomes. The military studied Holland for decades afterward. Staff colleges analyzed the tactical decisions. Infantry schools used it as a case study in close-quarters combat. Special operations units examined it as an example of audacity as a force multiplier. And all of these analyses reached the same conclusion. What Leonard Funk did should not have worked. The Germans were armed. They were organized. They outnumbered him 20-1. And yet it worked, because Funk understood something that the Germans did not. That in close-quarters combat, the advantage goes not to the larger force, but to the force that acts first and acts decisively, and does not stop acting until every enemy is dead or incapacitated. This is not a lesson that translates easily to modern warfare. Modern combat happens at longer ranges with more technology and less opportunity for individual action to determine outcomes. But the principle remains. Initiative matters, speed matters, and the willingness to commit fully to a course of action, even when that course of action seems suicidal, can create opportunities that careful planning cannot. Leonard Funk never claimed to be special. In the few interviews he gave in his later life, he described Holland as a situation where he ran out of good options and chose the least bad option available. He described the killing as mechanical, not emotional. He described the aftermath as exhausting rather than triumphant. And he described his decision to feign surrender and then open fire as obvious given the circumstances, even though no one else who examined those circumstances thought it was obvious at all. Perhaps that was the difference. Perhaps Leonard Funk saw obvious solutions where other men saw impossible problems, because he had spent 7 months in conditions that redefined the possible. Perhaps, after Normandy and Holland and the Bulge, his baseline for what constituted an acceptable risk had shifted so far that walking into a street full of enemy soldiers and starting a gunfight did not seem particularly more dangerous than any of the 100 other situations he had survived. Or perhaps he was simply the kind of man who, when confronted with a binary choice between accepting defeat and attempting something insane, would always choose the latter. The prisoners that Funk recaptured in Holland were sent to the rear and eventually to permanent prisoner of war camps. Some of them survived the war. Some of them were interviewed by historians years later, and all of them remembered the small American sergeant who had tricked them into believing he was surrendering and then killed 21 of their comrades in less than a minute. They remembered it with a mixture of horror and professional respect, because even in defeat, even in humiliation, they could recognize exceptional soldiering when they saw it. Company C of the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment survived the Battle of the Bulge and went on to participate in the final campaigns of the war in Europe. They crossed the Rhine. They moved into Germany. They helped liberate concentration camps and saw things that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. And through all of it, Leonard Funk remained their first sergeant, maintaining discipline and logistics and the 1,000 small details that kept a military unit functioning, even when that unit was exhausted and traumatized and counting days until they could go home. The war ended in May of 1945. The 82nd Airborne returned to the United States in early 1946, and Leonard Funk, who had jumped into Normandy in June of 1944 and had fought continuously until April of 1945, finally got to rest. He was 29 years old. He had been in combat for 11 months. He had been awarded the Medal of Honor, 3 Silver Stars, 2 Bronze Stars, and the Purple Heart. And he wanted nothing more than to never hear a gunshot again for the rest of his life. He got his wish. His 33 years with the Veterans Administration were defined by paperwork, not bullets, by phone calls and meetings and the slow, grinding process of helping men who had been broken by war piece their lives back together. It was not dramatic. It was not cinematic, but it mattered. And in its own way, it required the same qualities that had allowed Funk to survive Holland: patience, attention to detail, and an absolute refusal to accept defeat even when defeat seemed inevitable. The question that remains is this: what do we take from Leonard Funk's story? Is it a story about heroism, about violence, about the difference between surviving and winning? Or is it a story about something more fundamental, about the capacity of certain individuals to function at a level that defies normal human limitations when circumstances demand it? Perhaps it is all of these things. Perhaps the point is not to extract a single lesson, but to recognize that Leonard Funk's 45 seconds in Holland were not an aberration. They were a crystallization of everything he had learned and become over 7 months of continuous combat. They were the product of training, experience, desperation, and a willingness to gamble everything on a single calculated risk. And they worked not because Funk was invincible, but because he was very, very good at his job, and because he understood that sometimes the only way to survive is to stop trying to survive and start trying to win. The 3 men who accompanied Funk on patrol that day all survived the war. They gave statements for the Medal of Honor recommendation. They confirmed the details. And they all said the same thing in different ways. They watched Leonard Funk walk into a street full of enemy soldiers, and they believed they were watching him die. And then they watched him kill 21 men and wound 24 others and emerge without a scratch, and they did not understand how it was possible. They still did not understand 50 years later when historians interviewed them for oral history projects. They had been there, they had seen it, and it still did not make sense. Perhaps that is the point. Perhaps the most meaningful moments in history are the ones that defy sense, that should not have happened according to every rational calculation, but happened anyway because someone refused to accept the rational calculation. Leonard Funk refused, and in refusing, he changed the outcome of a small battle in a small Belgian village that most people have never heard of. And that small battle, in turn, was part of the larger battle that prevented the German offensive from succeeding. And that larger battle was part of the war that determined the shape of the 20th century. It is difficult to draw a direct line from 45 seconds in Holland to the defeat of Nazi Germany. The Battle of the Bulge was decided by logistics and air power, and the cumulative weight of thousands of small unit actions across hundreds of miles of front. But Leonard Funk's action was one of those small unit actions, and it mattered. It preserved Company C as a fighting force. It prevented the Germans from using Holland as a base for further operations. And it demonstrated to both Americans and Germans that even in desperate circumstances, even when surrounded and outnumbered, it was possible to reverse outcomes through sheer audacity. Leonard Funk died in 1993. He was buried with full military honors at a cemetery in Pennsylvania. His Medal of Honor was donated to the 82nd Airborne Division Museum at Fort Bragg, where it remains on display alongside hundreds of other artifacts from the division's long history. And his story continues to be told in documentaries and books and staff college lectures as an example of what is possible when training, experience, and desperation combine in exactly the right proportions. But the story that is less often told is the one about what Leonard Funk did after Holland, about how he came home and built a life defined not by violence but by service, about how he helped thousands of veterans navigate the bureaucracy that stood between them and the benefits they had earned, about how he raised a family and lived quietly and never sought attention or acclaim for the thing that made him famous, about how, in the end, he measured his life not by the men he killed, but by the men he helped. This is a harder story to tell because it is less dramatic. It does not fit neatly into 30 minutes of narration. It does not have a climax or a moment of transcendent action, but it is arguably the more important story, because 45 seconds of violence, no matter how significant, are still just 45 seconds, and a life is measured in decades, not seconds. Leonard Funk understood this. He lived accordingly. And when he died, the people who knew him best remembered him not as the man who killed 21 Germans in Holland, but as the man who spent 3 decades helping veterans and who never let his wartime service define him. History has its own priorities. It remembers what it remembers, but perhaps, in remembering Leonard Funk, we should try to remember the whole man, the soldier who made an impossible decision and executed it perfectly, and the veteran who came home and spent 33 years doing work that mattered but that history will never celebrate with the same enthusiasm. Both men were Leonard Funk. Both deserve to be remembered. And both, in their own ways, demonstrated that heroism is not about dramatic moments, but about consistency of character across decades. So here is the final question, the one that matters more than any tactical analysis or historical evaluation. What defines a life? Is it the extraordinary moments, the ones that end up in Medal of Honor citations and military history textbooks? Or is it the ordinary moments, the ones that involve helping people and raising families and doing work that matters even when no one is watching? Leonard Funk never answered this question explicitly, but he lived an answer. He lived a life that contained both extraordinary and ordinary moments, and he treated them with equal seriousness. And perhaps that, more than anything else, is what makes his story worth remembering. Thank you for watching. If this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing to the channel and sharing your thoughts in the comments. I am curious, when you think about legacy and what makes a life meaningful, do you believe it is defined more by dramatic moments of action or by decades of quiet service? What would Leonard Funk himself have said? Let me know your thoughts below, and I will see you in the next video.